The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, the kind that creeps in just before something unforgettable unfolds. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens poised and cameras angled, sensing the atmosphere was heavier than usual. The large oak doors swung open with a deliberate creak, and Pam Bondi entered with the kind of swagger that signaled she wasn't just here to observe. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her stride was confident, almost theatrical, as if she had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. Her eyes scanned the room, calculating, and finally settled on Justice Amy Coney Barrett, seated calmly at the bench. A faint smirk played on Bondi's lips, the kind that hinted she had something bold up her sleeve. The contrast between the two women was striking. Barrett, in her dark judicial robe, exuded composure, serenity, and restraint, while Bondi radiated energy that bordered on confrontational. The low murmur of courtroom staff arranging files and microphones added to the hum of anticipation. Lawyers at the side tables glanced at each other, wondering if today's proceedings were about to veer into controversial territory. A bailiff called the court to order, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Everyone rose. The moment Justice Barrett formally took her seat, Bondi's gaze remained fixed. It wasn't just another legal session, this was a showdown. The energy in the room shifted. Seasoned reporters leaned forward, cameras rolled with an almost predatory precision. A few clerks exchanged glances, already sensing that today's hearing would make headlines. Bondi took her designated seat at the front with calculated poise. She didn't fumble with her papers, didn't glance around nervously. She knew exactly where she was, and exactly what she was about to do. The air felt heavier. Even the flickering of overhead lights seemed to dim in anticipation. Justice Barrett looked up briefly, eyes meeting Bondi's with a calm that almost felt defiant. No words had been spoken yet, but the silent exchange between the two was already electric. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the first spark. Pam Bondi slowly rose from her seat, gathering her notes with a deliberate pace that demanded attention. She didn't need to speak loudly to command the room, her confidence did that on its own. She walked toward the lectern with a poised yet assertive demeanor, pausing just long enough to make sure every eye was on her. Her expression was unreadable, but the glint in her eyes suggested this wasn't just a legal argument, it was personal. Clearing her throat softly, she began, "Your Honor, I must admit, I find it rather puzzling." Her tone was cool, edged with a mock politeness that only thinly veiled the disdain beneath. She continued, dissecting one of Justice Barrett's recent rulings with surgical precision, but the language she chose was laced with sarcasm. "You see, most judges consider precedent a cornerstone of the judiciary. But in your case, it almost seems optional." The courtroom collectively stiffened. That line wasn't just criticism, it was provocation. The attorneys seated behind Bondi raised their eyebrows, unsure whether to admire her boldness or brace for impact. She kept going, her voice steady, her words like polished arrows. "And I wonder," she said, turning a page with exaggerated care, "if you truly understand the consequences of your decisions. Because the last time I checked, real lives are affected, this isn't some theoretical chessboard." There were audible murmurs in the gallery. One spectator shifted uncomfortably in their chair, sensing the boundaries of courtroom decorum being tested. Justice Barrett didn't move, she didn't flinch, but Bondi noticed, and perhaps that was the point, to provoke a reaction, even a flicker of emotion. Bondi tilted her head slightly, feigning curiosity, as if her sharp words were nothing more than innocent inquiry. "I mean no disrespect, of course," she added, the smirk on her face betraying the opposite. "I'm merely asking the questions many Americans are wondering, but perhaps too afraid to voice." Her voice carried through the chamber, not loud, but deliberate, soaking into every wall and corner. There was a long pause. The kind that felt staged, purposeful. Bondi let her final question hang in the air. "Do you believe justice should be grounded in empathy, or ideology?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone in the courtroom was frozen, eyes darting between the two women, waiting for the response. A camera light flickered red, recording every second. Bondi had made her move. The challenge had been laid down not with shouting or fury, but with icy control. All that remained now was to see how Justice Barrett would respond. Justice Amy Coney Barrett remained still, her posture upright, her hands gently resting on the bench. The silence following Bondi's pointed question could have shattered glass, it was that sharp. But Barrett didn't rush to fill the void. She allowed the moment to linger, to settle, to stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Her eyes, cool and clear, met Bondi's with unwavering focus. There was no flicker of annoyance, no flash of irritation. Just calm, composed, controlled. She gently adjusted a document on the bench, then looked up again, her face the picture of restraint. When she finally began to speak, her voice was low but unmistakably firm. "Ms. Bondi," she said slowly, each syllable weighed, "in this courtroom, we deal in facts, not impressions." Her tone was free of emotion, but its precision made the statement feel like a direct cut. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The authority in her words was enough to reclaim the space instantly. Barrett didn't blink. "Judicial decisions," she continued, "are not made with the luxury of hindsight or the indulgence of political convenience. They are grounded in law, guided by precedent, and carried out with fidelity to the Constitution." Her words were crisp, deliberate, and controlled, like the slow turning of a key in a lock. The audience hung on every syllable. Even the court reporter, usually detached, momentarily paused in surprise before her fingers resumed flying across the keys. Justice Barrett didn't flinch under Bondi's insinuation, nor did she let it alter the rhythm of her response. Instead, she leaned in slightly, not physically, but intellectually, matching Bondi's intensity without echoing her tone. "Empathy has its place in the human heart," she said, almost gently. "But in this chamber, it must stand beside reason and the rule of law." That one line seemed to send a shiver across the room. It was quiet, thoughtful, but delivered with an underlying strength that silenced even the whispers. Barrett turned a page in her notes with an unhurried calm, like a professor gently guiding a lecture back on track. "You mentioned real lives, and you are correct, they are impacted every day by these rulings. Which is precisely why we cannot afford decisions based on performance or passion, but on principle." There was no anger, no rebuttal designed to wound. Just clarity, and that, more than anything else, seemed to take the oxygen out of Bondi's sails. The courtroom, now wrapped in Barrett's composed energy, sat frozen. Reporters who had prepared for fireworks were instead witnessing something more powerful, control that couldn't be provoked, a calm that wouldn't be broken. Barrett folded her hands once more and concluded, "This court is not a theater. It is a forum for justice. And justice, Ms. Bondi, is not loud." The final words from Justice Barrett seemed to echo through the courtroom long after her lips stopped moving. A stillness settled over the space, deep and total, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of what had just been said. Not a single person stirred. Even the faint scratching of pens and the mechanical clicks of camera shutters halted as if instinctively silenced. It was a kind of reverence, or perhaps shock, not from volume or spectacle, but from the quiet authority of a response so sharp, so composed, that it left no room for rebuttal. Pam Bondi, who had moments earlier commanded the room with her assertive tone and icy sarcasm, stood immobilized at the lectern. Her eyes didn't drop, but there was a visible shift in her stance, her posture a touch less firm, her fingers tightening around her notes as if searching for stability. Justice Barrett, meanwhile, had returned to her papers, calm as ever, as if she hadn't just delivered one of the most poised takedowns ever witnessed in that courtroom. The contrast was stark. The judge hadn't raised her voice, hadn't delivered any dramatic gestures or accusations. And yet, somehow, she had completely altered the energy in the room. Her calm wasn't passive, it was commanding. She had met Bondi's fire with ice, and in doing so, had left the entire courtroom speechless. Several attorneys glanced at each other, some raising their eyebrows, others slowly shaking their heads in disbelief. A clerk who had been nervously jotting notes looked up with wide eyes, her pen hovering midair. In the gallery, a young reporter mouthed the word, "Wow," without making a sound, her fingers scrambling to type what she'd just witnessed. Even the judge's aides, usually impassive and stone-faced, allowed the briefest flickers of reaction, a tightened jaw here, a raised brow there. Justice Barrett had just demonstrated something rarer than outrage or domination. She had shown control so complete that it rendered confrontation futile. Pam Bondi remained silent, her mouth opened slightly, perhaps to interject, to defend, to reframe, but no words came out. There was nothing to latch onto, no weakness in Barrett's reply to exploit, no sign of vulnerability to leverage. Just an impenetrable calm, and that, more than anything Bondi had said or done, disarmed her. She slowly stepped back from the lectern, her earlier confidence noticeably dulled. For a brief second, her eyes met Barrett's again. This time, the judge's expression hadn't changed, but something in Bondi's had. A flicker of recognition, maybe even respect, or defeat. The silence persisted for a few moments longer, stretching into something nearly sacred. Then, like the faintest ripple breaking the surface of a still pond, a cough sounded from the back of the room. It was enough to trigger movement. Reporters began typing again, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Legal assistants glanced down to resume note-taking. A camera operator readjusted his lens, making sure to catch Bondi's changed expression. But the emotional gravity of the moment lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. Justice Barrett's words, measured and unshaken, had shifted the entire tone of the hearing. No gavel had fallen, no verdict had been declared, but the power in the room had clearly changed hands. As the courtroom slowly returned to motion, the silence that had followed Justice Barrett's reply still echoed in people's expressions. The audience began to shift again in their seats, but no one dared speak. Some stared blankly ahead, others looked down, processing. The once sizzling energy Bondi had brought into the room now hung limp, like a curtain after a show. And yet, something even more intense was brewing beneath the surface, an unspoken realization that they had just witnessed a masterclass in composure. In the back row, a journalist hastily typed up a headline, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. Justice Barrett responds with silence more powerful than any shout. A senior reporter beside her whispered under his breath, "That was a mic drop without a mic." Pam Bondi sat back down, but the confidence in her posture had noticeably faded. Her gaze lingered on her notes, though it was clear she wasn't reading them. Her jaw was clenched in thought, and her fingers drummed lightly on the table, searching for rhythm, for control, something she no longer had in the room. She adjusted her blazer as if to recenter herself, but the quiet reactions from around her, the subtle glances, the tight smiles, made it clear she had lost the moment. And in a courtroom, moments like these mattered more than transcripts. Justice Barrett, in contrast, appeared completely unbothered. She flipped a page in her binder with the same ease one might display while sipping morning coffee. There was no victory in her expression, no self-congratulation, just discipline, just resolve. That composure, far from being passive, had taken on the weight of authority. The court clerk glanced at the judge, waiting for the next instruction, but Justice Barrett remained still for a few seconds more, allowing the gravity of the exchange to be fully absorbed by everyone present. It wasn't long before the reactions began trickling out across the internet. Tweets emerged, each trying to capture what had just happened in 280 characters or less. One viral post read, "Pam Bondi came in swinging, but Amy Barrett didn't flinch." She replied with calm precision that left the whole courtroom stunned. Another added, "No yelling. No insults. Just a response so perfect, Bondi forgot her next move." The digital world outside was catching fire while inside, the storm had already passed, leaving only the smoke of its aftermath. Somewhere near the front row, a legal intern whispered to their mentor, "Is that how power works in a courtroom?" The older lawyer just nodded, eyes still fixed on the judge. "That's how power works when it doesn't have to prove itself," he said quietly. Bondi eventually lifted her eyes again, slowly surveying the room. She noticed the lack of applause, the absence of nods. People weren't against her, but they were no longer with her. It was a shift not in verdict, but in respect. Justice Barrett finally spoke again, her voice as even as ever, instructing the proceedings to continue. But nothing was quite the same. The room had heard what it needed to hear. The message had been sent, not with bravado, but with elegance. Pam Bondi sat in silence, regrouping. But everyone else, lawyers, reporters, citizens, left the courthouse that day carrying a story. Not of a courtroom clash, but of a moment where grace, unshaken and precise, left the loudest echo.